All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DEP's webinar on the Natural and Working Land Strategy. I'm Heather Genovich, a research scientist in the Division of Science and Research at New Jersey DEP, and I've had the pleasure of working with some of DEP's finest from across the department on developing the Natural and Working Land Strategy. The purpose of this meeting today is to go over the targets or goals that we have developed for the strategy and to get feedback from all of you, many of whom work in these fields every day. The primary purpose of the strategy is to maximize carbon sequestration in New Jersey's natural and working lands. Now, when I first began working on this project, the term working lands was new to me. So for anybody else who might be uncertain exactly what that means, working lands include farms, certain forests, and any other lands from which we get products. This strategy will lay out specific actions that can maximize sequestration on public lands, and there's going to be some opportunities for private lands as well. So before we really dig in, I want to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded along with a transcript, and it will be posted on our website with the presentation materials. The last time I checked, we had over 200 people registered, and we have representatives from conservation groups, environmental consultants, government agencies, universities, and more. We're really pleased to have folks from all of these sectors here to help guide this strategy. In a meeting this large, it's really important that we cover some ground rules. We are using the webinar format in Teams, which means that attendee microphones and cameras are off by default. You can provide comments or ask questions in the chat at any time, but we ask that you limit your discussion to the topics that we're covering today. There will be a time for folks to raise their hands and ask questions verbally after we present each land type. You'll see a slide come up that has a big question mark on it, and that's the perfect time to add something. We'll be able to call on a few people. Whenever I do call on one person at a time, I'll temporarily allow microphone privileges. Then on your end, you'll have to actually turn your mic on as well. So you'll just click on the microphone icon. Video feed doesn't work really well in this format, so we're not going to turn cameras on for folks that are speaking. Now, our main purpose for being here today is to share the progress we've made on the strategy and to hear from you. We will consider every bit of input that we receive, but we are not going to issue a response document. After these 4 meetings, we're going to take back your comments, integrate them where appropriate, and continue writing the strategy. And we do plan the release of the strategy to happen sometime in the 3rd quarter of this year. If you find that you have additional comments for us after the meeting, there is a comment form on our website, and I'll give you some more details on that later in the presentation. I'm going to throw this link up here like 20 times during the presentation, but maybe Aiden, you could drop it in the chat for everybody just so that they could copy and paste it. So here's a brief agenda. Again, my name is Heather Genovich, and up next, Helene Barr will discuss the impetus for the strategy and how it fits in with DEP's climate initiatives. Mattia Jepsen is going to give an overview of what will be in the strategy and how we developed our targets. She'll also present the targets for tidal and non-tidal wetlands. Mattia will be followed by Nina Colagiovanni, who will share the targets for aquatic habitats, and there will be time for a few questions following each of those sections. We'll have a longer Q&A period when we're finished presenting at the end, and then I'll wrap up the meeting with a focus on what's next, how you can review the targets, and how you can submit comments online. So now I am going to pass the mic to Helene.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Heather. I am Helene Barr, and I manage the Climate Change and Clean Energy Bureau here at the department. And I'm just going to give you a bit of quick background on the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals, some of our efforts to date, and really how that natural working land strategy fits into the big picture. So, as many of you probably already know from I see some of the attendees, the state's climate action is guided by a series of greenhouse gas reduction goals. The Global Warming Response Act in particular calls for New Jersey to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2020. And we've achieved that goal, which is exciting and awesome for New Jersey. And then we have another goal, which is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions 80% below the 2006 level by 2050. So we need to drop our emissions down to about 24 million metric tons. Today, we're hovering a little under 100. So 3/4 of our emissions have to get cut by 2050. And then in 2021, Governor Murphy further strengthened our state's reduction commitments by signing Executive Order number 274, and that established an interim target of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 40%, or excuse me, by 50% by 2030. So as you can see, we have a lot of work cut out for us. Meeting the ambitious goals of 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050 is really going to require an economy-wide transformation that demands like all sectors, levels of government, companies, communities, and individuals to really accept and adopt fundamental changes in how we consume energy, produce waste, and interact with our natural lands. In 2020, the department released the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report. This is really the state's climate action plan. The report identified the various pathways to achieving our 80 by 50 reduction goal, as it predated our interim goal. And the report identified 7 different emission sectors of New Jersey's economy. It modeled how the state can achieve reductions in those sectors and provides very specific policy recommendations for action. The report laid out 3 major pathways to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. First, replacing our fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles, converting our space and water heating in the residential and commercial sector buildings to electric heating, and then replacing our fossil fuels in the electric power generation sector with renewable energy sources. However, even if we achieve all 3 of these major transitions, New Jersey is not going to reach its greenhouse gas reduction goals without significant protection of our natural working lands. Carbon sequestrated is absolutely needed to offset our gross emissions. Currently, we estimate that the state sequesters about 8 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in our natural lands, and by 2050, we'll need at a minimum to maintain that amount and potentially increase it upwards of 10 million metric tons. However, as we all know, our natural lands are continually threatened by ongoing development, by sea level rise, and by disease. Therefore, it became really abundantly clear that carbon sequestration as an ecosystem service really needed to be centered as a value in the department's work. And many of the recommendations in the 80 by 50 report really focused on helping the state, and in particular, the department develop a plan and targets around carbon sequestration, and collectively these recommendations are now being addressed via this natural working land strategy. So since 2020, the department has released a series of reports and plans to identify, address, and reduce the impact of climate change. And a common thread throughout these plans and these reports is the role of the state's natural working lands in capturing and storing greenhouse gas emissions, providing resiliency and various ecosystem services. Just to briefly touch on some of these, we had the 2020 science report on climate change that identified the impacts to our natural lands from a changing climate. We had our global warming response report, which I just discussed. We also released our Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative Strategic Funding Plan, and this identified a steady stream of funding to enhance the state's forest and tidal wetlands. And then in 2021, we had our Climate Resilience Strategy, which identified the role of nature-based solutions to support resiliency goals. Additionally, we have our New Jersey Wetlands Program Plan and our Forest Action Plan that both evaluate and consider the role of these lands in protecting carbon sequestration. So the natural working land strategy really takes the work of all these reports further by strengthening the state's commitment to protecting and enhancing the carbon pools of its natural lands through the adoption of carbon sequestration targets by land types, by identifying really actionable land management practices. And this strategy will in turn be used as a feedback loop to inform future iterations of all of these plans, the development of incentive programs and regulatory policy. So with that, I will hand it over, I believe, to Mattia.
Thank you, Helene. So my name is Mattia Jepsen. I am a wetland scientist and a bureau chief in the Division of Science and Research at the New Jersey DEP, and I've been working especially on the blue carbon work for the natural working land strategy. So I wanted to just go over briefly how carbon sequestration works. So plants pull carbon dioxide from the air as part of photosynthesis, and then that carbon gets stored into the leaves and the roots of the plant. Both living and dead plant materials, fungus and microbial biomass, are considered to be sequestered carbon. So some of the as plants die, as their leaves fall off, as the plants die, that carbon gets shed into the soil and then gets incorporated into soil biomass. So there's both living biomass and dead biomass that are both considered to be sequestered carbon. So once plant material dies, some of that carbon is re-released into the atmosphere when microbes and when the plants respire, and that can be re-released as carbon dioxide, as methane, or as other gases. When natural and working lands are disturbed by natural or human activities, there can be a decrease in the rate of carbon storage or an increase in the re-emission of stored carbon. Land management strategies can be used to protect stored carbon and to increase the rate of carbon storage. So for the cases of the natural working land strategy, we are talking about forests, wetlands, agricultural lands, aquatic habitats, and developed lands. And today we'll be focusing on wetlands and aquatic habitats. In order to help jumpstart land management practices that will increase carbon sequestration, the department has been working collaboratively with the New Jersey Department of Agriculture for the past 2 years in developing this evolving natural and working land strategy. And this identifies detailed strategies that will mitigate the impacts of climate change through carbon storage and sequestration. These strategies include specific land management, program development, and policy actions that will be implemented by state agencies to protect stored carbon and increased carbon sequestration in New Jersey's natural and working lands. So in this way, the state will be in a better position to meet the 80 by 50 emissions targets that Helene discussed. The recommendations in the strategy are expected to be broadly applicable to other groups that manage land in the state as well. So the landowners, land managers, nonprofits, universities, and policymakers from other jurisdictions are also key audiences for the strategy. We kicked off the strategy in May of 2021. We released the scoping document, as mentioned, in December of 2021. And since then, we've been working on recommendations and target developments. So now we're at the phase of taking those recommendations and targets out to stakeholders, and we expect the final strategy to be released in the third quarter of 2023. So I wanted to go over a little bit about how the strategy has been developing. So the first step was to review other groups' natural working land strategies. We looked at other states, we looked at the federal government, we looked at other countries, and we compiled a list of these land management activities and policies that people had recommended for carbon sequestration. Then we developed these some expert work groups, one for each habitat type, and they worked to hone the list so that it was appropriate for New Jersey. So they removed things like mangroves, which we don't have in the state, at least not yet. And so anything that wasn't applicable to the state was removed from the list. Then the work groups took the remaining strategies and activities and did some research and potentially some modeling and tried to get some ideas about the carbon benefit of those activities, the cost of doing those activities, and the scalability. And by scalability, we mean, is this something that we can do at one location in the state, at 50 locations in the state, at 10,000 locations in the state? Like how much could we scale this practice up? Because we're looking at so many different land types and so many different potential activities, we couldn't quantify the benefits of each one. So for this first iteration, what we did was we made sure that we had some sound scientific literature to back up the idea that these activities would have a net carbon sequestration benefit. That was the key to it being passed on to the next phase. Then we also tried to get some estimates of costs and scalability. We ranked each one of those things on a scale of 1 to 3. And then based off of that, each expert group decided what would be included in this first iteration of the natural and working land strategy. In addition, we asked the expert work groups to fill out some fact sheets on the recommendations. We wanted to know who would implement these, what would happen, where would they happen, when, why, how. We asked them to identify impediments to implementing these programs. We asked them to evaluate what the impacts on overburdened communities would be of implementing these activities. And we also asked them to comment on whether or not climate change would affect the ability to implement these practices. And then finally, we asked them to pick targets for 2030 and 2050. So how much of this activity could we implement by 2030, and how much do we think we could implement by 2050? All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Thanks, Mattia. Before we dive into the details on our targets, I want you to keep these questions in the back of your mind while you're listening. In particular, we want to know if there's anything missing from our draft list of targets. Please remember that any practices you suggest must have published scientific literature confirming a net carbon sequestration benefit. Next, we want to know if you see any targets that you think do not belong on these lists, and we want to hear why that is the case. To improve the chances of succeeding in meeting these targets, we need to identify and address key obstacles to achieving them. So we'd like to know what obstacles you foresee. And lastly, we know that all of these goals will come at a cost, and we'll need to pair funding mechanisms with our targets. So we want to hear about any potential sources of funding that you're aware of. And I'm going to use this slide a few times, so I'll pull it up after each topic is presented. But I just want you to, keep these in the back of your head and see if you have anything to offer after you hear about the targets. Thank you.
Okay, so I think this is Mattia again. It's back to me. So first we're going to talk about wetlands. We'll talk about tidal wetlands and non-tidal wetlands, and then I'll pass it off. I guess then we'll discuss the questions that Heather posed, and then I'll turn it over to Nina. So in New Jersey, wetlands cover approximately 21% of the total land area. So we have a lot of wetlands in the state. Wetlands have many different benefits. So out of all of New Jersey's natural and working lands, the ecosystem services provided by wetlands provide the largest economic value. We have in freshwater wetlands, it's estimated that there are nearly $16,000 per acre annually, or approximately $13 billion per year. Saltwater wetlands provide $8,500 per acre annually, or $1.6 billion per year. And there have been studies that have found the very large economic benefits in terms of storm damage protection in the tidal marshes during Hurricane Sandy. Tidal wetlands also provide essential nursery habitat for over 75% of New Jersey's important fishery species. So tidal wetlands can store carbon in the soils for millennia. And the reason that they're so efficient at storing carbon is because they are wet. So when soil is wet, it slows down the process of microbes breaking down the carbon that's stored. And so it can be stored for a much longer period of time than in forests and other areas where the soil is not saturated. Despite covering less than 1% of the ocean's area, tidal wetlands store over 50% of the seabed's carbon reserves. Collectively, global salt marshes have an estimated carbon burial rate of approximately 4.8 million metric tons of carbon per year. So in terms of the draft targets for tidal wetlands, first we'll talk about land management practices, and then we'll get into some of the more policy and programmatic things. So the first thing is in protecting the carbon that's already been sequestered in the soil. And we can do this by installing living shorelines. Living shorelines prevent the erosion of existing tidal marshes, so that protects the tidal marsh habitat, meaning that it can continue to sequester carbon into the future. And it also protects the thousands of years worth of stored carbon in the marsh edge. So we are expecting to be able to install 7,800 linear feet of living shorelines per year by 2030, and then we'd like to be able to scale that up to 10,000 linear feet per year by 2050. The next is in salt marsh restoration. So here we're specifically targeting an increase in the number of acres of salt marsh vegetation per year. And that's because the salt marsh vegetation is what does the sequestering of carbon. So we're hoping to be able to do 70 acres of salt marsh revegetation per year by 2030 and 200 acres per year by 2050. The next mechanism is in restoring hydrology. So here we're looking to take wetlands that have restrictions in their tidal flow that are making them be fresher water, have less salt in the water than they would naturally if we remove the restriction. And that's because freshwater wetlands produce methane, which I'll get into in a minute, but it's a much more powerful greenhouse warming gas than carbon dioxide. So if we reflood those tidal wetlands and increase their salinity, we can decrease the amount of methane that is produced. So it's decreasing the amount of greenhouse warming gases that are emitted. Those projects often can increase the resilience of those marshes to sea level rise and can also increase their percent cover of vegetation, so thus increasing carbon sequestration potential for the future. We don't have a lot of those projects in the state that happen at the moment, so we're hoping that by 2030 we can do 1 per year, and by 2050 we can increase that number to 2 per year. And last, we have protection. So protecting the areas where salt marshes will be in the future as sea level rises. And protecting those areas from development is beneficial in protecting the habitat, which is likely sequestering carbon now, and it also maintains those areas for the future when they may become our future salt marshes. Okay, so in terms of the policy recommendations, we have the recommendation to develop best management practices for maximizing carbon sequestration in blue carbon projects, integrating lessons learned from earlier implementation projects. We'd like to have that by 2030. We'd like to develop and maintain public outreach campaigns, create a voluntary wetland stewardship program similar to federal programs that incentivize restoration and stewardship on private lands, such as the Natural Resources Conservation Services Wetland Reserve Program. We'd like to educate and assist private landowners and developers in the management of their lands to minimize impacts to wetlands and reduce the risks of climate change. Some of the other things we'd like to do is reevaluate Green Acres and Blue Acres programs to consider prioritizing the acquisition of land and conservation easements that will protect areas with high current carbon storage and future sequestration potential. We want to develop a blue carbon action plan, develop a pipeline of projects so that we can continuously identify blue carbon projects and assist with the design and permitting so that we always have a list of shovel-ready projects when funding becomes available. We want to review state and local natural hazard mitigation plans and climate adaptation plans to ensure that wetlands are incorporated as essential green infrastructure. In terms of funding, we're looking to evaluate the adoption of a blue carbon market or other incentive program to help fund wetland conservation and restoration in New Jersey. And in terms of regulations, we'll investigate the potential to reduce the drivers of degradation and destruction in high carbon coastal systems by implementing or improving wetland protection regulations in tidal areas. Okay, so we'll do questions before we get into the non-tidal things. And Heather, I guess I'll just leave the slide up if you want to.
Sure, sounds good. So it looks like we have Alex with his hand raised, or her, I'm sorry, I don't know offhand. Let me allow your mic, and then Alex, you'll have to turn your mic on.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Alex from Pew Charitable Trust. This all sounds great. Just curious, because I know in the scoping document, it was mentioned that greenhouse gas inventory would be completed for all of the national working land habitat types. So curious if a blue carbon greenhouse gas inventory would be developed as part of this blue carbon action plan.
So yeah, we had hoped to be able to do that type of accounting for this first iteration, but it ended up being a much larger project than we had bargained for the time frame that we had. So yes, that would be part of a blue carbon action plan, and also probably it'll also be included in a lot of the carbon inventory work that Helene mentioned that we're doing.
Thank you.
All right, up next, we're going to go to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, you might have to turn the mic on your end as well. We're not getting any audio, but if you'd like to add something in the chat, we'll definitely look over there.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Bluetooth wasn't picking up. So my apologies. So I'm Jacqueline Rhodes. I'm with Pinelands Preservation Alliance. And in regards to living shoreline, my question is, does it have to be planted? Because we've been working with it for a number of years now with Raritan Valley Community College, Dr. Jay Kelly, who also helps with NDEP, with just fencing portions of beaches so that the seed bank can grow in order to kind of achieve some of the same things that we're seeing with some of the living shorelines. Obviously, I know some places you need planting, but in other places it might be an opportunity and also cost savings. So is that being taken into consideration under the living shoreline heading?
So for this, we're not getting into that specific of details. I think that's something that we're interested in looking into is that, you know, if you plant a living shoreline, how many years does it take to, you know, for plants to establish and to have, you know, your targeted density versus if you don't plant it, you know, kind of what is that difference? So it is something that we consider and have been thinking about, but there aren't any set guidelines for it, I would say, at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Heather, do you want me to take a question from the chat? And then I'll pass it back to you for other hands that are raised.
That sounds great.
Okay, so we have a suggestion to include USDA CRP SAFE program that can provide incentive funds to convert land to tidal marsh vegetation that is threatened by sea level rise, more so in the private land space, but connected to the WRE program. So thank you, Kristen, for that suggestion.
All right, and it looks like we have Jim up next, so I'm going to allow your mic, Jim. And you'll have to turn it on.
Yeah, hi. Just a quick question with the development of a project pipeline. I guess, is there a process that's already been identified of how that's going to work? And two, how will that account for existing work that's going on by various conservation groups across the state?
So it's something that we are just kicking off and working with the Nature Conservancy and other folks, you know, within DEP and around the state, and it will definitely be a partnership. I think we're looking at having, you know, anyone who wants to be in the space involved in the project pipeline development. And I think also as part of that, we are, you know, through CRAP, we are trying to track both projects that have been completed, projects that are partially completed and are looking for more funding, as well as the desire for future projects. So I think we're working pretty well together as a team at this point to capture sort of all phases of projects. Heather, do you want me to take another one from the chat?
That sounds good.
So next we have Sam. With your current timeline and the increase in development, do we think this timeline is too long compared to the? Oh, it keeps jumping. Extensive rate of development, and are we doing anything now to stop that? So I think in terms of those are really good questions. The reason that we have the timeline at 2030 and 2050 is because it lines up with the goals that were set out in the 80x50 report. And I know in terms of tidal wetlands, what we did for developing our targets was to take a look at what the rate has been over the past six-ish years of implementing these projects, thought about how much funding there is and sort of the capacity that there is in the state now, and tried to push that a little bit for our 2030 targets and then really push it for our 2050 targets. So this is kind of what we thought was both realistic with some extra effort put in. I think there's sort of endless number of these projects that we could do, but it's definitely a good question to think about, you know, competing with development. Heather, do you want to take one? If anyone else's hands are raised?
Sounds good. Let's see. I'm having a hard time changing Judith's status. So we're going to skip that for the moment, but we'll go to Elizabeth next, and I'll come back to you, Judith. I just saw it go back out.
Good afternoon. This is Betsy McShane, the state biologist for the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I was pleased to see that you had highlighted our Wetlands Reserve easement program and are looking into developing a state counterpart towards that. And in working with that program for many years, I'm wondering if you have included in your section on regulatory challenges a strategy for working with the Bureau of Tidelands Management and some of the complications of tidelands and developing clean easements for acquisition.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, I don't think that that's listed in there, so that's a great one to add. Thank you for that.
Sure.
All right, Heather, should I take one from the chat?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we have Bob Talon. Okay, so this looks like it's a crop question, which is great, and we will definitely note it down, but we don't have, you know, anyone on from the folks who worked on the ag for this point, so we will note it and definitely address it during the ag one.
All right, I'm going to give Judith the microphone now.
Okay.
Hi, good to see you, Mathia. I bet you know what I'm going to ask. The P word that hasn't been mentioned so far. Mathia and I and a bunch of other people were on a pretty important paper that came out a couple of years ago on salt marsh loss in New Jersey. And one of the things that was in this report was indicating that Phragmites, which is generally removed and despised, enables marshes to elevate faster. But in light of today's topic, it also absorbs a lot more carbon than native salt marsh species. So I was hoping that there might be some mention of that here and some attempts to figure out how to keep some of the Phragmites on the marshes to do the good things that it does and not knee-jerk reaction remove it whenever there's enough money to do so, which seems to have been the policy pretty much up till now.
Yeah, so we have left Phragmites out of these. I think that it's something, Judith, as you know, we went back and forth about, yes, it sequesters a lot of carbon, but there's also more pathways potentially for methane to be released. So I think it will be something that needs a little deeper dive, and will probably, you know, would be put in a more detailed action plan.
Okay.
So there are some helpful comments in the chat. I'm seeing a direction to work with county mosquito control agencies on planting living shorelines. We are reconvening a work group on living shorelines, and we'll make sure that that comes up in discussions there. Lots of good input here. I don't see any more hands raised, so we will get ready to move on to non-tidal wetlands. Somebody did ask if we're going to share the slides. We are planning to post the slides on our website. We're also planning to post the recording. I will warn you though, this is really wild. My slides are showing up in German. So if they happen to be in German on the recording, we may or may not put that up. Hopefully they remain in the English language and that you're all seeing that and no one else is having these problems. But we're gonna jump back to Mattia and she'll cover non-tidal wetland targets.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and if you have any other follow-up questions, yeah, feel free to keep putting them in the chat. So non-tidal freshwater wetlands have many benefits, and they account non-terrestrial wetlands, so these non-tidal freshwater wetlands in North America account for approximately 36% of global wetland carbon stock. And we know that they're really important for species, for filtering water, for filtering the air. We recognize that non-tidal wetlands provide a myriad of benefits. But when it comes to carbon sequestration, it's a little bit complicated because yes, they have a very high density of carbon storage, but they also produce methane. And methane is a much more powerful greenhouse warming gas than carbon dioxide. So while they're sucking carbon dioxide out of the air, they are also producing methane. Methane has a shorter amount of time that it lasts in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And so depending on the time frame that you're looking at, 1 unit of methane is equal to either 25 or 86 units of carbon dioxide with respect to its global warming potential.
Mattia, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think we're still on slide 18 here. Do you have control right now?
Thank you. Okay.
No problem.
And are you now seeing the non-tidal freshwater wetland slide? Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, so this is something that just needs more research, and you'll see that this is why we have fewer activities that are mentioned and kind of more of these policy programmatic scientific research things that we need to develop. Okay, so the major target that we're setting for non-tidal wetlands is to restore Atlantic white cedar swamps. And the goals here, the targets for 2030 are 10,000 acres, and the goals for 2050 are 20,000 acres. And you'll notice also that this is per time period and not per year. For the tidal wetlands, we were looking at it per year, and this is just per time period. In terms of research, we're looking to do some better mapping of non-tidal wetlands, especially in peatlands. We are looking to advance the research on the net greenhouse gas benefits of non-tidal freshwater wetland conservation, enhancement, and restoration. So under what circumstances can we document that there is a net benefit of doing these practices in non-tidal wetlands? As part of that, we think it's important to create a statewide non-tidal freshwater wetland monitoring network that will do research and monitoring and document trends and be able to help us answer this research question about carbon sequestration in non-tidal wetlands. And we'd like to perform some education and outreach to the public as well as landowners of non-tidal wetlands so that they can better understand the long-term greenhouse gas benefits of non-tidal wetlands. All right, so then we're jumping back to questions about non-tidal wetlands. All right, Heather, it looks like for this so far, we don't have anything in the chat. Do you want to get to people who have, some people have their hands raised, I think.
Yeah, before we jump to that, if Helene or Tony are still on the call, Kim B has a question about a contact for hydro, tidal, solar, or wind power generation. So if you have somebody in your green energy group that you could recommend for Kim, we're definitely doing work in those areas, but it's sort of spread out throughout DEP. So I'll leave that up to Tony if he has a suggestion there. And also, it looks like Kristen has her hand up. So I will give you mic privileges. Go ahead and turn on your microphone.
there, this is Krista Maestrel with New Jersey Audubon. So I have two questions. One is a little bit more general, and this kind of goes across all of the natural and working lands, right? Is like, how are we going to reconcile some of the competing goals and strategies, right? So if we're thinking about climate change and carbon sequestration, that doesn't always jive well with things like biodiversity and other things. So like Judith's comment earlier about Phragmites, right? Like that may help improve carbon sequestration, but it also does not promote biodiversity, which, at times can be interlocked. So that's kind of more of a very broad general question. But then, specific to the wetlands, natural lands, has there been considerations on the regulatory aspect of restoring wetlands? So like I'm thinking immediately with the Atlantic white cedar restoration, much of that has been, either funding, funding limitations, but then also, right, the issues with forest stewardship planning and some of the regulations that are surrounding that. And then also, for instance, like pinelands regulations that may, slow down or prevent some of these actions to happen. So is that kind of being discussed or considered?
Okay, so yeah, so first for the ecology, it's a really good point and something we should have noted to begin with. I think, we are not expecting people to undertake any of these projects in exchange for ecological function. And the biodiversity, maintaining biodiversity is certainly key. So I think we had talked about having in the strategy itself a big call out box about that. So thank you for bringing it up, and it is something that is on our minds. And then in terms of the regulatory aspects, and specifically for cedar, I know I have not been involved in the development of the Atlantic white cedar management plan, but the first 10,000 acres is in a plan already that forestry has put out. And I know that they've done a lot of careful planning around it. But we can also get some of those answers back to you. But we'll definitely take a look at the regulatory portions, the pinelands, and the funding. We'll make sure to address those.
Mattia, can I jump in for a second? So there's also a comment in the chat about the white cedar swamp goal, asking how many acres there currently are in New Jersey. I believe the amount was 30,000 acres. There is an existing published strategy from our forestry group on restoring Atlantic white cedars. Also, Eric pointed out, why is this the only afforestation or reforestation target? And it's far from that. We're going to have another session on forestry that is March 28th at 2 o'clock. And you'll see quite a few other targets related to that. This just happens to be the one that's occurring in our non-tidal wetlands.
Yeah, so current estimates according to that plan say that there are between 25,000 and 42,000 acres of Atlantic white cedar. And that's down from what is believed to have been the historic high of 100,000 acres in New Jersey prior to European settlement.
Also from the chat, Paul Long asked how much research has been done around seaweed farming. There has been a good amount of research in it. There's several other benefits. You can co-locate it with aquaculture to buffer acidic seawater. We've also been looking into it for possible biofuel sources. There isn't a lot of it going on, on this scale in our area right now. Kelp grows better further north for these kind of things, but you will see some more information on that. There's going to be a report coming out from our Science Advisory Board on biofuels soon, and there is a significant section about seaweed farming. So Paul, if you're curious for more information, you can follow DSR's website for that. Isabel also asked, sorry folks, it's a little loud here. She asked if we're considering conversion of non-tidal to tidal wetlands, and there are some projects, Mattia, where you're talking about raising salinity. That's what that means, right? Bringing the saltwater into the non-tidal wetlands.
So I think Isabel's question is more about in the salt marsh, the transition zone. So what is currently upland, and we We have been discussing that. I think it's really complicated because it really depends on what the habitat is there, what's there now, and there's this habitat kind of trade-off. But it's something that is on our list to have some more research into, is looking at those transition zones and the best ways to manage them for current and future ecology as well as carbon sequestration.
And while we're still on the cedar topic, Brooke mentioned salt intrusion and ghost forest. So I know part of the Atlantic White Cedar Restoration Plan did look at sea level rise vulnerability. So they are targeting sites that have some cedar already so that you'll have a seed source there and they'll have a better chance for success. But also considering very much so sea level rise and if they'll be vulnerable in the future.
Yeah, I think Heather, yeah, sea level rise, they've identified areas that would be outside of sea level rise and also outside of storm surge for that reason. But saltwater intrusion is a different, is kind of maybe a different story. But I haven't, again, I'm not an expert in this, but we'll definitely note that in terms of the question in the strategy about vulnerability to climate change.
Emil has a hand raised. I'm going to allow your mic. Okay, I see that you clarified in the chat a comment about inland ghost forests of Atlantic white cedar. I do believe that our forestry group surveyed all of the habitat that they believe was historically inhabited by Atlantic white cedar. So I would imagine that this was part of that survey whenever they were considering what's available for restoration. All right, Mattia, it looks like we got everybody here. So up next,
I think there's one more question from Russ Finari. In the non-tidal area, are you looking at developing plans to enhance freshwater wetlands in the Central Passaic that have invasive species impacts? So at this point, we feel that we need to do some more research about the net benefits of the net carbon sequestration in non-tidal freshwater wetlands before we make plans under this particular plan to do work in freshwater wetlands.
Okay, let me try Emil again. There was a problem before. So I allowed mic on my end, and then you'll have to turn it on your end as well.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. I see now. Thank you. Oh, yeah. The thing about inland ghost forests is very different than what you thought I meant. So throughout the Pine Barrens, there are a tremendous number of causeways or interior sand roads through the state forests and parks across floodplains that were built ages ago. And they have small culvert pipes. And they were built when there weren't any beaver. And many of them are being plugged now, and cedar swamps are being drowned. Now, obviously, we all know that beavers build dams all over the place, and they have impacts and make beaver ponds. But some of these causeways are many feet in height, particularly in Brendan Burns State Forest. A series on the Rancocas tributaries, causeways, every half mile or mile. And when the beaver plugs a pipe, it raises the water level 3-4 feet. And so there's a famous one called the Devil's Hairbrush, which is a huge ghost forest. So there's a lot of cedar at risk. And we're having a very hard time getting anybody to pay attention to that. I think part of a strategy could be to take stock of the fact that we don't need all these sand roads crossing wetlands. They're just not needed. And hang on one sec, please. We just need to remove some of these causeways and culvert pipes so that we don't end up losing acres and acres of cedar swamp while we're trying to create cedar swamp in other places. There's just no reason for all these old roads to be maintained and to have all these culvert pipes at risk to being plugged by beavers, which are obviously the population is exploding, and there's no way to deal with that.
Thanks, Emil. That sounds like a more cost-efficient way of restoring cedar swamps than, you know, starting afresh. So we'll certainly pass that on to our forestry group and our parks folks as well.
Thank you.
All right, I think we're ready to move on to Nina with aquatic habitats.
All right, hello, good afternoon. My name is Nina, and I am a biologist trainee within Fish and Wildlife's Bureau of Marine. I am a relatively new hire, and I'm excited to be presenting today on habitats. So aquatic resources and habitats in New Jersey may include rivers and lakes, oyster reefs, freshwater and saltwater aquatic vegetation, and more. Originally, we were looking at including shellfish and aquaculture in our aquatic habitats. However, the literature sequestration in oyster reefs and aquaculture is somewhat limited with varying results. For instance, a recent study stated that whether or not shellfish farming can be considered a carbon sink is controversial. However, these habitats should not be dismissed from the blue carbon conversation. For instance, oyster reefs are removal and improving water quality, yet there's been varying results to determine whether they are considered carbon sinks or stored. So future research will determine the role of shellfish in aquaculture with regard to carbon sequestration, and we'll continue to monitor future literature for the potential of carbon sequestration by shellfish within New Jersey. One benefit in the relation of shellfish and SAV, which is going to be our focus today, in relation to carbon, is that shellfish are threatened by ocean acidification as climate change progresses, and this can have a negative impact on their growth. So submerged vegetation habitat and thus more carbon sequestration, this can provide benefits for pH sensitive species like shellfish. So this is noting. If you've never heard of the term SAV before, this is referring to submerged aquatic vegetation such as seagrasses. And in New Jersey, the two main species of interest are eelgrass and widgeon grass. Seagrass meadows provide an essential refuge for shellfish and finfish, and they also play an important role in sediment stabilization in our coastal waters. Seagrasses are able to reduce wave energy, slowing down the flow of water and causing sediment accumulate and trap organic matter like carbon in order to prevent it from re-entering the atmosphere. And while seagrasses only cover about floor, they manage to store about 10% of the carbon buried in our oceans each year. While New Jersey's seagrass habitat has been declining in size and density in recent decades, it still provides one of the most efficient carbon burial rates of any ecosystem type, and carbon burial executed by seagrasses is estimated to occur at a rate of about 1.38 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. However, SAV is especially vulnerable to threats like changes to water clarity, physical disturbance to habitat, temperature changes, and an exploration of these parameters and their changes will provide an understanding of SAV to changes, which leads us into our drafts. So our first recommendation falls under monitoring, and this is one of the most important set of targets. So we have to develop a dedicated and consistently funded SAV monitoring program, to conduct an SAV aerial survey with field validation, and our 2030 goal is about every 2 years to more annual assessments, and then have SAV health parameter assessment program. Under conservation, we have to protect SAV from further loss, and these items together are to create a dedicated and consistent SAV monitoring program. The last aerial conducted roughly 14 years ago in 2003 and 2009 by Rick Lathrop at Rutgers University. And due to some challenges in the 2009-2003 data speaking well with one another, a new assessment is needed to reestablish a baseline. For instance, most states conduct surveys every year or every few years, but New Jersey has never had dedicated funding for this type of mapping work. And this type of work is key in understanding SAV coverage in order to current status, health, and abundance in order to properly manage SAV. So
Nina, just a second. I'd like you to try to turn off your camera. Your audio's just kind of skipping in and out, so that may help the transmission.
okay, thank you very much. Is that any better?
Right now it is. Thank you.
So some good news is that with the help of our colleagues over at DLRP, DEP real work happening this spring and summer. So once again, the mapping will be conducted by Rick Lathrop at Rutgers University, with field validation conducted by Elizabeth Lacey at Stockton over at the A partnership and DEP staff, with an initial focus to establish extent of seagrasses within Barnegat Bay and Little Egg Harbor, and then hopefully with funding into 2024 to move upwards towards coastal river systems like Manasquan and Metedeconk, and then hopefully stay. So under management practices with targets, under education, launch public outreach and educational programs for recreational and commercial stakeholders to be aware of potential impacts to SAV. We are hoping to have this done in 2030 within 5 years, and then to expand the program to create the Alliance, which is an advisory group consisting of SAV practitioners, academia, nonprofits, and SAV conservation and restoration efforts across New Jersey. Under policy recommendations, we have to promote SAV protection at local, state, and federal levels by developing new programs, policies, and regulations. And here you'll see that next 3 targets, or I apologize. The first one, our 2030 goal, is within 2 years, and then to expand the. Under mitigation, we have to adopt regulations requiring all functional and temporal impacts to SAV habitats. Under restoration, we have to create and fund an SAV restoration program with targets of X acres enhanced per year, and under guidance to develop SAV restoration guidance with suggestions for best practices, adaptive management strategies, and success criteria. So it's important to note the difference between mitigation and restoration. So mitigation comes into play when avoidable. Restoration is more of a feel-good practice, and currently within the state of New Jersey, mitigation is required for certain projects within the coastal zone management rules. Restoration involving SAV is cost. Instead, we view conservation as the priority, as restoration results have been more missed than hit. More research is needed to understand which methods may provide, especially within the state of New Jersey, and or transplanting adult shoots, and there are methods to explore, including broadcast by hand, mechanical planting, seed bags, and more. However, when impacts to SAV are unavoidable, a compensatory mitigation should be implemented, and this could be advised through the SAV Alliance. Efforts to restore SAV for mitigation and post-restoration monitoring can all be protecting any damage in the first place, or a need for restoration may be the best solution. Under guidance and guidance manuals to help those interested in SAV restoration have those reference materials and aid in successful efforts. Okay, so now I'll pass it over to Heather.
All right, sounds good. So we have a little bit of action here in the chat. The first question is about what research would be needed to include aquaculture in these targets. And like Nina said, she's pretty new to the department, but I have also turned on Kira's mic. Kira's been with DEP a bit longer, and wondering if she would like to chime in on this one.
Sure, no problem. So when it comes to aquaculture and the use of that in carbon sequestration, a lot of that has to do with the nature of the shellfish species, understanding their growth patterns, and also the movement of the industry. So we typically consider the aquaculture industry to be cyclers more than sinks, because you have shellfish that are put into the system and shellfish that are removed from the system as a result of commercial sale. So to better understand where those sources and sinks would be and how that cycle works through itself is to better understand both the individual species' ability to sequester carbon in their shells and in their tissues, and at the same time, the utilization of our industry and leases that are available throughout the state. So that would mean understanding things like the species and the stocking density at a particular lease area, or rather throughout all lease areas. It may also involve understanding what the input and output product sale are at different species sizes. So for example, you know, a chowder clam is going to have a different carbon sequestration ability than a little neck clam. So all of those pieces of information would be necessary for us to really understand how carbon is cycling through that industry.
So it looks like the next comment in the chat is related to whether offshore wind funding could help cover the cost of this need. Kira, I know there's some plans to survey SAV in the next few years. Is any of that funding from the offshore wind projects, or is that from somewhere else? Would you happen to know?
I'm not exactly sure what. I don't know that I can answer that question. So the reference to the work that's going to be an update in Barnegat and Little Egg Harbor Bay is independent of the offshore wind funds. I don't know at the moment that the RMI is prepared to do any of that particular work, because that's more of a research monitoring aspect of it. So at the moment, I don't think that those two are related.
Thank you. And there is another comment here about opportunities for inland aquatic resources in non-coastal areas. We did talk a little bit about non-tidal wetlands and kind of mixed results in the research as to whether the emissions of methane are offsetting the amount of carbon that's being stored. So Kelly, if you had any other specific suggestions there, we'd be happy to look into it. And it looks like Ned has a hand raised.
Yeah, actually, before we move on to Ned, would it be all right? I can also jump in a little bit on Kelly's question about non-coastal aquatic resources. So it's possible Kelly's also referring to freshwater submerged aquatic vegetation. So that would be the things that you find in your lakes and river systems. So in marine fisheries, that's not quite our bailiwick, but it is certainly an opportunity to consider, because those are aquatic plant species that are prevalent throughout the state. I don't know what the status of those populations are and what their distribution patterns are, though.
Thank you, Kira. Ned, you'll be able to turn your mic on now.
Thank you very much. I apologize for the quality of my voice. The wind stole it yesterday. Hi, Kira. Hi, everybody. As New Jersey Shellfish Association, I do have to say that I think we're missing from the target oyster reefs. I think the Natural Oyster Reef Program, aside from the aquaculture, but the Natural Reef Oyster Program is basically New Jersey as a state farming carbon. Those carbons are being harvested from the waters, and then we are putting them inland. I mean, when I say inland, I'm talking inside the country, and we are exporting carbon that then goes into a landfill, and that is the best form of a carbon sink. I understand there's questions about research with carbon cycling and aquaculture, but when we're talking about taking calcium carbonate and burying it in the ground, I think it's a common sense sort of thing. Secondly to this, though, is the third part of your question, which was for fourth, which is funding. We are a foundational unit when it comes to funding. The New Jersey industry has a self-imposed tax that allows us to fund the shell planting program. This has been deemed non-sustainable and will be running out. The New Jersey Shellfish Council just put forward the first increase in dozens of years that involves a 25% increase to this. And if we're talking about matching funds to matching programs, I think we're missing out on a big one here. I think there's a lot of carbon to be farmed in New Jersey, and I think oysters is the wampum to do it. So I really hope that you reconsider this, spend some time on some research. I think there's definitely work to be done here. Thank you very much.
We appreciate that, Ned. Thanks for commenting. All right. Does anybody see anything else in the chat right now that we need to address?
I do not.
All right, we are in good shape there. No hands are raised. So we have a few more minutes here. Honestly, we have room until 4, but once the conversation dries up, we'll probably end the call. You all can think about these targets a little bit, and I'll just cover what happens next. So this is the first of 4 virtual stakeholder meetings. We have 3 more of them coming up over the next 2 weeks where we're going to cover developed land. We'll go over agriculture and then forests. Let's see, what else? All comments need to be submitted by April 14th, and the website is up here once again so that you can visit it to see our full list of targets. Hopefully everybody got the email with that in it, but if not, visit this website. You'll see everything that we have proposed to include in this strategy. Also, we're going to synthesize what we've heard today, see what we can do with that to fit some of it into here and move forward with writing. And we are planning to publish the strategy in the 3rd quarter. I do see hand raised. I'll come back to that in just a minute. I'm just going to run through this in case anybody needs to leave. So I have a few slides here to just show you where to go on the website. So the full list of targets is over here under the Natural and Working Land Strategy Resources box. There's a PDF you can pull up. And then if you want to submit comments, there's a drop down just under all these green boxes here. So it'll populate a comment form. It'll look a little something like this, and you can fill that out and get make sure your voice is heard and that we have everything that we need to consider as we develop this strategy. So let's see, Emil has a comment. I'm going to go ahead and turn your mic on, or at least on my end, you'll have to do the same.
Hi, thanks again. I just have a quick question because I don't know very much about this regarding methane. So when you were talking about non-tidal wetlands and methane, just before you started talking about Atlantic white cedar, were you mainly thinking about sort of emergent wetlands, or were you thinking about methane across the whole gamut of some herbaceous non-tidal wetlands all the way to forested wetlands like red maple swamps and cedar swamps and that kind of thing? I have a gut feeling that there must be a big difference, but maybe I don't know.
So yes, we were thinking about methane produced anything from freshwater submerged aquatic vegetation through swamps, non-tidal swamps. And I suspect that there is a big difference, but it wasn't something that we had the expertise or the time to be able to look into in detail. And what we were able to look at, the messages seemed quite mixed and also quite specific to the habitat type.
Oh, okay.
So yes,
great.
I think you're right that there is that it's variable depending on habitat type.
Yeah, I'm just going by, when I sink into an emergent marsh, it smells way different than when I sink into a cedar swamp.
Right. Yep.
Thanks.
So we'll hang on here for just a few minutes if anybody thinks of something else they want to add. But otherwise, for folks that want to drop off, we hope to see you back for some of our other meetings. And we appreciate you spending your valuable time with us, especially all of this input on the strategy. I think you've given us a lot of things to think about, pieces that we should consider as we're setting priorities and as we're figuring out how to make all of this happen in the real world. So thank you. And for anybody that needs to leave, have a good evening. We'll stay maybe another 5 minutes and see if anybody else has something they want to add. Sorry, I see a hand raised. Zachary, I'm going to turn your mic on. You'll have to switch it on your computer as well.
Great, thanks, Heathers. Am I coming through okay?
You're good.
Awesome, thanks. And apologies for the delay. I was just going through the targets once more. And first of all, it says Zach Greenberg with the Pew Charitable Trust, but just curious if the team can provide a little more information on the, I guess, the protection recommendation for tidal wetlands, the one that says protect and manage salt marsh migration zones. Is that, are these zones established, or would this strategy provide recommendations to establish these areas, or just sort of curious if there's a little more information there. Thank you.
So we do have the salt marsh migration zones mapped. So these would be areas where there isn't development currently, and where the slope, there's a handful of different things that are included in that. And we have areas mapped for 1 feet of sea level rise, 2 feet of sea level rise, and maybe 3 feet of sea level rise. So we know where we expect marshes to migrate inland. In terms of how to manage them, we don't have any guidance established at this point about that, but that would be something that we would be looking to do.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you.
So Sam, who is on here as a guest, I see you have a comment in the chat about how do you find groups or programs so that as local landowners you can be more involved? And I'm curious what kind of areas you were interested in. If you're thinking like afforestation or reforestation, if you're talking about wetlands, or just, if you have any more information, maybe we can assist you with that. And I did turn your mic on if you want to talk. If not, feel free to type in the chat. I see your mic isn't working. Hey, so on my end, I allowed you to speak, but I think you have to click on the microphone icon now. See if that'll help. No worries, Sam. If you're unable to get on there now, I just dropped my email address in the chat, and you can reach out to me later if you want to talk about this. I see there's a hand raised from Hugh. All right, you should be able to turn your microphone on now.
Anyway, I had just had contractors leave, so I missed like the first like half hour. So will this presentation be available recorded, or the slides at least, or?
We're planning to post both the recording and the slides on the Natural Market Land Strategy website. So the link is in the chat and it's on some of the slides here as well.
All right, that's excellent, very good. And I'm signed up for the forest one as well, so I'll
Great.
Hopefully I'll be there on time. Thank you so much. Take care.
You're welcome.
We'll see you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. All right, I think we've heard from everybody. The comment form is available online. If something comes up after the meeting, that will come to us as well. And again, we welcome you all to come to any of the subsequent stakeholder meetings. You can register the same way on the website. Thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful evening.